Here's the thing, folks. I often find myself thinking about crazy hypotheticals, What if pigs could fly? What if unicorns were real? What if this channel reached millions of people one day? And I thought to myself, in the event of that, what kind of voice am I going to be? What's my purpose? And I knew immediately in the beginning my goal is either to entertain, inform, or be the lolcow that you can throw tomatoes at and sure, whatever. I'll take AdSense off that. But I named this channel Internet Catharsis because sometimes I plan on being a relief conduit, either because I'm the noise you drown things out to, I'm the entertainment that you need to get that chuckle in the midst of all the chaos so that you feel just a little bit better, or I'm the guy that you can listen to go on a nutty rant and you identify with the frustration. So there's just that kind of relief that we can share together. But there's another role that I'm going to play because I play it in my personal life, so I might as well do it here. And that is, I'm going to be the guy sometimes that tells you what you might not want to hear, but what you might need to hear. And so that in the event that something like this happens, that you are prepared for it mentally, emotionally, and you've had time to digest it. Now, before the Russian troll farms come out and start pumping me full of views and cheering me on and, thinking that I'm carrying out Putin's whims, let me be perfectly clear. I'm an American. I understand the desire for independence very well, as do we all in this nation. I can understand wanting to get out from under the boot of a tyrant who is trying to take your land again. And I understand it. And a lot of what Russia is doing right now, there are geostrategists that saw this coming. In part because of history, because history tends to repeat itself. And coming from a behavior analytic background, I find that history is also useful as a source of data collection points, because when you understand how a civilization came to be and the history that shaped it, you can then predict some likely outcomes in various facets of a nation's existence. And in fact, if I ever do get a sizable number of subscribers, I'm definitely not going to do this before then, because this would be an arduous undertaking. It's practically a dissertation project, but essentially what I'd like to do is take a country's history and essentially analyze behavior patterns on the battlefield, economically, diplomatically, and based on all the information, use what behavior analysis is intended to do, which is to describe, predict, and control behavior. And based on that, we can make some predictions about what some nations might do. But Russia, their military tactics have not changed all that much since the days of Peter the Great. In essence, it's fire cannons until everything in front of them is rubble, and then they send a few conscripts to stand on top of it who are barely sober enough to stand at all. And that leads me into the sad part of this, is that people are wondering, when is this war going to end? When is Russia finally going to call it quits? They've lost over 1 million soldiers. They're on a full-time war economy. Their economy is in insanely bad shape. They've got to be ready to quit, right? And the sad truth of it is, they're not even close, and they're not going to stop. And there's a couple reasons for that. One, because they have a lot more suffering that they could take. We may be living in the modern world, folks, but this is a country of over 144 million people. So the way they see it, they've got easily another 140 million people to go before they're ready to call it quits. This is a country that has lost tens of millions of people before and kept fighting. They have a long history of it. But moreover, and this is for me kind of the sad part, because I've known Ukrainians who had to flee Ukraine and told me stories about the chaos when they were leaving their homeland. And my heart goes out to them. But geopolitics is a very cold, cold game where very big decisions are constantly being made. And Russia has made it very clear they intend to reconstitute the USSR. Now, they will not do that. But they likely are going to try not just for Ukraine, but for the Baltics, Romania, these places. And because we are so preoccupied with China and have been telling Europe for a very long time not to strengthen diplomatic and economic ties with Russia, that you're not creating a relationship of interdependence. What you're doing is you're tightening the noose around your own neck. Germany had to find out the hard way why you don't make yourself economically dependent on Russia, because Russia applied pressure like a mafioso, and Europe started to wake up and realize they had a real situation on their hands, but they've still been pretty slow to react. And they're going to want to do that because Russia's not going to stop. Because for those of you who are thinking this is some kind of war of a man on his last year's dying wish, he wants to be Peter the Great, he wants conquest, he wants loot, he wants Russian prestige. Ladies and gentlemen, that is not what this is about. And Peter Zeihan does a good job of covering this point. But Russia is effectively running out of Russians. So they're not doing this for money, for land, for power, prestige, for extra resources. They're doing this because Russia is running out of Russians. Okay? Now, it's important to remember Russia is, and always has been, an empire. You have Moscow that has the Muscovites, and Moscow does really well. That's probably where Tucker Carlson went to go to his little boutique trip that he did for some weird reason. But outside of some of those nicer places within Russia are places that essentially look like what we imagine Siberia looks like. And that is all of the surrounding tribes within Russia. It's essentially Muscovites in the center, surrounded by Chechens, Georgians, Mongolians, Asians, all people from all over the place. And they are used as cannon fodder and for labor. And right now, because of a very long trend of some state-sponsored activities, and it is completely the fault of the oligarchs. They had such a horrible value of human life that they kept certain institutions in place that allowed the population to dwindle further and further. And there's a variety of reasons that this population crisis is occurring, but these types of things don't occur overnight. And two of the big factors were state-sponsored alcoholism and biological warfare from Afghanistan in the part of plentiful quantities of absolutely pure heroin. And that fueled opioid addiction, and it fueled alcoholism. And alcoholism has been a staple of Russian society, sponsored and industrialized by the Romanovs. But even before that, well before, even in the medieval times, it's essentially how you kept serfs happy and alive. Well, not happy, but, willing to live and willing to work, because vodka was so cheap that peasants had no shortage of it, and alcohol does a couple of things. One is it helps you forget that you're hungry, and two, it makes it very, very hard to have a revolution, because when you're too drunk to stand up, you tend to be too drunk to have a revolution. And that's how the rich and powerful wanted it in Russia, and that's how they got it. And that, among some significant other factors, contributed to this, what is now a crisis that is irreversible unless they can reincorporate several places that they deem Russian. They see them as ethnic Russians. They can take them back into the fold and continue a population growth process that basically they're going to try and restabilize and have way more babies. And a lot of people might be thinking, well, it's Russia, they're our adversaries, who cares? And I'm just showing you here a couple of things. There was another article as well that I could not find. It got lost in the ether, that Russia actually has implemented a special forces group with the a population task unit to address this demographics crisis. And a lot of people might be thinking, it's Russia, who cares? They've been our adversary basically right after World War II. Fuck them. Let Russia destabilize and let them fall apart. And I understand your sentiment, but there are a couple of problems with that. Number one, whether you hate some Russians or not, I highly doubt you hate every Russian who's ever existed. And if you think that a war between Russia and Ukraine right now is bad, wait until a country of 144, almost 145 million people fracture into sections and start fighting over territory. All the different ethnic and religious groups that are in Russia. Imagine how that plays out. That's problem number one, because we're talking about close to 100 million deaths at that point, up to. But there's another problem, and a bigger problem, a much bigger problem. See, the U.S., we haven't just been pulling away from Europe because Europe has been slacking on their NATO spending, despite the fact that we have warned them time and time and time again that Russia was never your friend. They were never going to be your friend. They were going to do this, and this was always in the cards. We've been predicting it for decades. But when something is decades away and people don't have that foresight, kind of like we didn't have the foresight to see that we were handing away our national security by letting China become the world's workshop, because we make the best weapons technology in the world, but we don't produce any of it. And that's kind of a conundrum. But China, in this partnership without limits, turns out there are limits. There's quite a few, and a leaked document from the Russian FSB that I meant to pull up for this video, but I will pull it up in one of my next ones because this is a very, very deep issue with a lot to unpack, and I have maps. Once I figure out how to actually graphically get the maps to do what I want them to do, there are actually 18 locations. 18 reasons why, in the event of Russia fracturing, China will have the capacity to either peaceably or not so peaceably take sections of Russia. And that is a nightmare scenario. For those who haven't looked into the prospect of conventional war with China, we are planning for it and we are expecting it. It was originally slated for around 2027, but currently President Xi is in the middle of dealing with some political issues and some purges because they've been taking notes and saw what Russian corruption looks like and realizes that theirs is probably actually worse. But luckily, they have managed to have such a strong industrial base that they likely have circumvented many of the issues that came from Russian corruption and their disintegrating industrial base. China has had a massive leap since the 1990s in military tech, both quantity and quality. Part of it is a result of IP theft, but you cannot build a military like they have off of IP theft alone, ladies and gentlemen. China is a very serious threat, and part of our strategic doctrine for how to deal with them in the event of a conventional war is to contain them within the first island chain and essentially wait for them to run out of resources, because China is not energy independent and they are not food independent. They have to import both. They have large swaths of Chinese starving right now, and they do not have enough oil to do everything they need to do on their own, even if they were not the world's factory. But it certainly doesn't help. Now, imagine if these two massive strategic weaknesses, arguably their biggest weaknesses, overnight became their biggest strengths. That they suddenly had control of some of the world's largest resource deposits. And so they not only had enough of these resources to use for all their needs, wants, and desires, but even had some left over that they could trade and make additional money on. It's a nightmare scenario, and one that we are not interested in having happen, and I don't think the rest of the world is either, because regardless of how people might feel about the United States, maybe you think we're the world police, maybe we stick our noses in places it doesn't belong, and I mean, yeah, but one thing that's hard to argue is if you look at some of the current world power players. You have the US, Russia, China, maybe a couple others, but really it's those three. China is an ethno-nationalist state under the current regime. They are fully authoritarian. They utilize some capitalist methodologies in order to generate revenue by which to perpetuate a communist establishment. But otherwise, they are a communist state, and Xi is a dictator who has concentration camps and has systematically worked to death millions of Uyghur Muslims. He calls them re-education camps. They're not. Nobody's reading books in there. That's essentially the alternative. That is, it's either the U.S. is at the head of a more democratic world Even if some of our rights have been trampled on, at least we still have some of them. Or we could live in a dictatorial state where a country that believes that a lot of us shouldn't even exist is now in control of our fates. So, the unfortunate and cold hard reality is that as painful as it would be to lose Ukraine and even the Baltics, the fact of the matter is the alternative is so much worse, folks. And again, this is going to be multiple videos because I have 2 different dossiers that I've compiled along with some military documents I'm looking through. I'm seeing if there's anything of value there. The PLA really doesn't like... They produce white papers, but it's mostly just the history of Mao Zedong and just goofy stuff. So I'm seeing if there's anything of substance there. But what is of substance that I have is information about all of the various Russian oil assets, particularly in the Far East, as well as the corresponding companies that China owns a very significant stake in. They're Russian companies, so you wouldn't think China is involved. They are not just involved, they are majority involved. There are 18 specific places that could be potential points of either attack or points of acquisition in the event of a destabilized Russia. So, in short, as much as I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but I do it so that we have time to process and digest and understand why Trump is sometimes making Neville Chamberlain seem more like Winston Churchill with the way that he's behaving with Putin. It starts to make a little more sense because not everything can be told to the American people. It's why we are being told that we are hitting Venezuelan ships because of Tren de Aragua and their drug trafficking, when the reality more likely is that we are looking for regime change to restabilize the region and kick out adversaries that we allowed to slip in. And it is the reason why we can't say, sorry guys, but we might have to give up Ukraine as well as a few other assets, countries full of people that Russia wants, because the alternative is a China that is going to become far too powerful. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is why it's important to touch grass occasionally in between reading about geopolitics, because sometimes geopolitics is a bitch. But I read it often, and I will come back with more, and I will keep you up to date on not just this war and the geostrategic implications of the goings-on of the war, but I will try and expose you to things that are not traditionally talked about, that are also backed with receipts. Again, when I figure out how to do graphics like an adult, I will finally put that video together. I already have all of the information that I need, and I already know what I want to include, but it's just a matter of putting it all together. So I will do that, along with how China's current capabilities that they've shown off at their recent parade tie into potential land acquisition. Oh, and one more thing. The FSB, they are concerned about a southern invasion from China. So that partnership without limits, apparently there are some limits there, because when Russia knows that they have 5 conscripts that are having a smoke break as their entire defensive line on the southern border with a country that has not only had historic land disputes with Russia, but is currently sending in loads of Chinese students to go and look up historical connections between current Russian land and how it used to be Chinese land, it certainly gives Russians a good reason to be concerned. So with that, folks, if you found any of this interesting, informative, ridiculous, and you want to see what next ridiculous thing this guy's going to say, like, comment, subscribe. I appreciate you guys, and I will see you on the next one.